The small apartment was always quiet in the early mornings. Sunlight slowly entered through a narrow window, touching the old wooden floor and the worn furniture. In the corner of the living room stood a keyboard that had clearly seen better days. A few of its keys were slightly faded, and sometimes one or two notes made a soft clicking sound before playing. But to the young woman who lived there, it was the most valuable thing she owned. She had loved music for as long as she could remember. When she was a child, she used to sit near the television whenever a piano performance appeared on screen. While other children watched cartoons or games, she watched the pianist's hands moving quickly across the keys. Something about it felt magical to her. At that time, her family could not afford music lessons. Life was simple and sometimes difficult. Her parents worked long hours just to keep everything running at home. There were always more important things to pay for: food, rent, school supplies. Piano lessons were something people talked about on television, not something that seemed possible for her. Still, the dream never left her. When she was about 10 years old, she discovered a small community center not far from where she lived. Inside the building there was an old piano that many people had forgotten about. It was slightly out of tune, and some of the keys felt heavy when pressed. But when she touched it for the first time, she felt something she had never felt before. The sound filled the quiet room. She did not know any songs at the time. She simply pressed the keys slowly, one by one, listening to how each note sounded. Even those simple sounds made her smile. From that day forward, she visited the community center whenever she could. Sometimes the room was empty, and she had the piano all to herself. Other days she had to wait patiently until everyone else left. At first she only played random notes, but slowly she started learning melodies she had heard before. She listened carefully to music on the radio and tried to copy the sounds on the piano. It took a lot of patience. Many times the notes sounded wrong. Many times she had to start again. But every small improvement made her feel proud. Years passed, and the piano at the community center eventually disappeared during a building renovation. For a while she thought her chance to practice was gone. Then one day an old neighbor gave her a used keyboard that had been sitting in storage for years. It was not perfect, but to her it felt like a treasure. She placed it carefully in the corner of the living room. From that day forward, music became part of her daily life. She practiced whenever she had free time. Early in the morning before leaving for work. Late in the evening after finishing her responsibilities. Sometimes she played quietly so she would not disturb the neighbors. Her fingers slowly became faster and more confident. She started understanding how different notes work together to create harmony. Even though she never attended a music academy, she spent hours watching performances online and listening to recordings of famous pianists. She studied their hand movements, their timing, and the way they expressed emotion through music. For her, playing the piano was not just about hitting the correct notes. It was about telling a story. Every song carried a feeling. Sometimes when she played, memories appeared in her mind. Moments from childhood, quiet afternoons, difficult days, and hopeful dreams. The piano allowed her to turn those emotions into sound. Not everyone understood her passion. Some friends told her that music was only a hobby and that she should focus on something more stable. They were not trying to be unkind. They simply believed they were being realistic. Professional musicians, they said, usually spent years studying in famous schools. They trained under experienced teachers and performed in large concert halls. Without that background, success in music seemed almost impossible. She listened politely whenever people said these things. But deep inside, she never stopped believing that music had a place in her life. One evening, while scrolling through her phone after work, she noticed an announcement that immediately caught her attention. A world-famous pianist would soon be visiting the city. The event was being organized by a local music academy. The pianist planned to host a special masterclass for young musicians. During the event, a few participants would have the opportunity to perform and receive feedback. Her heart began to beat faster as she read the details. This pianist was known around the world. Concert halls across many countries had welcomed his performances. His recordings were studied by serious music students everywhere. For a moment, the idea felt impossible. Someone like her had never performed in front of an audience like that. But another thought slowly appeared. What if this was the chance she had been waiting for? She spent the rest of the evening thinking about it. Part of her felt excited. Another part felt afraid. What if people laughed? What if her playing was not good enough? The doubts came and went. Late that night, she sat down at her keyboard and began to play one of the pieces she loved most. The melody started softly, filling the quiet apartment. As she continued playing, something inside her changed. The fear slowly disappeared, replaced by determination. Music had always been honest for her. When she played, she was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply expressing what she felt. Maybe that was enough. The next morning, she searched for the event registration details. The masterclass allowed a limited number of performers to apply. Her hands hesitated for a moment before filling out the form. She almost closed the page twice. But eventually she finished the application and pressed the submit button. After that moment, all she could do was wait. Days passed slowly. Sometimes she forgot about the application while focusing on work. Other times the thought returned suddenly, making her wonder whether she had made a mistake. Finally, one afternoon, a message appeared in her email. Her application had been accepted. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the screen. Then she read the message again to make sure it was real. She had been selected as one of the participants. Excitement rushed through her, but so did nervousness. Performing in front of a famous pianist and a room full of musicians would not be easy. That evening she returned home earlier than usual and began practicing immediately. The piece she planned to play was emotional and powerful. It required focus and careful control. Sometimes she played it beautifully. Other times mistakes appeared. Whenever that happened, she simply started again. Practice continued day after day. The event date slowly approached. Every time she sat at the keyboard, she imagined the concert hall, the audience, and the moment when she would walk toward the piano. She did not know what would happen that day. But one thing was certain. After years of practicing alone in small quiet rooms, she was finally about to share her music with the world. The morning of the masterclass arrived sooner than she expected. The sky was still pale when she woke up, and for a few seconds she simply stared at the ceiling, remembering what day it was. Her heart began beating faster. Today was the day. For weeks she had imagined this moment. She had pictured the concert hall, the audience, and the famous pianist sitting nearby, listening carefully to every note. Now the moment was finally real. She sat up slowly and looked toward the keyboard in the corner of the room. The familiar instrument had been her companion for years. Many late nights and early mornings had been spent practicing on those keys. She walked over and pressed a few notes softly, just to warm up her fingers. The simple sound helped calm her nerves a little. After getting ready, she left the apartment earlier than necessary. She did not want to risk being late. The streets were still quiet, and the cool morning air helped clear her mind. During the ride across the city, she kept thinking about the opportunity ahead of her. This masterclass was not a small event. Many talented musicians had applied to participate. Some of them had studied in respected music schools and had years of formal training. She reminded herself that she was not there to compete with anyone. She was simply there to play the music she loved. When she finally arrived at the music academy, the building looked even larger than she imagined. The tall glass doors reflected the sunlight, and banners near the entrance showed pictures of the visiting pianist. Inside, the lobby was already filled with people. Students were carrying sheet music, teachers were having quiet conversations, and volunteers were guiding guests toward the concert hall. The atmosphere felt both exciting and serious. She checked in at the registration desk and received a small badge with her participant number. Holding it in her hand made everything feel more real. Soon everyone began moving toward the main hall. The room was beautiful. Rows of comfortable seats faced a large stage where a grand piano stood under soft lights. The instrument looked elegant and powerful at the same time. She quietly found a seat among the other participants. Some of them looked calm and confident. Others were whispering nervously to themselves or reviewing their sheet music again and again. She noticed how professionally many of them carried themselves. Some spoke about their teachers and the music academies they attended. Their conversations included words and techniques she had only read about online. For a moment, doubt appeared in her mind. Did she really belong in this room? Before she could think too deeply about it, the audience suddenly became quiet. A door near the stage opened, and the famous pianist walked in. Everyone began applauding immediately. The pianist greeted the audience politely and took a seat near the piano. His reputation had reached far beyond this city. Many people had traveled just to watch him teach and share his thoughts about music. He began the masterclass by explaining how the event would work. Each participant would perform a short piece, and afterward he would offer comments and advice. The first performer walked onto the stage. The young musician played with confidence and skill. The music filled the hall beautifully, and the audience listened with full attention. After the performance, the pianist offered detailed feedback. He spoke about technique, expression, and the importance of understanding the story behind every piece. One by one, the participants continued performing. Some performances were fast and energetic. Others were soft and emotional. Each musician brought a different style and personality to the piano. While waiting for her turn, she listened carefully to every note. Her nervousness slowly returned. Many of the performers were clearly very experienced. Their hands moved across the keys with impressive speed and control. She quietly reminded herself of something important. Music was not only about perfection. It was also about honesty. Eventually, a volunteer stepped closer and called her participant number. Her heart skipped a beat. It was her turn. She stood up slowly and walked toward the stage. The bright lights made the audience harder to see, but she could still feel hundreds of eyes watching her. Every step toward the piano felt heavier than the last. When she finally reached the instrument, she took a deep breath and prepared to sit down. Before she could begin playing, the pianist spoke. He asked her a simple question about her musical background. She answered honestly. She explained that she had learned mostly on her own and practiced whenever she could find time outside of work. For a brief moment, the pianist looked thoughtful. Then his expression changed slightly. He asked whether she had ever studied at a recognized music academy or trained under a professional teacher. She quietly shook her head. A soft murmur passed through a few people in the audience. The pianist leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His voice remained calm, but his words carried a tone that made her heart sink. He explained that the world of professional piano was extremely demanding. Years of structured training were usually necessary to reach a high level of performance. Without that foundation, he said, it could be very difficult to compete with musicians who had spent their entire lives studying under experts. The room felt very still. Some audience members looked uncomfortable. Others simply watched quietly, unsure of what would happen next. The pianist continued speaking. He suggested that passion for music was admirable, but sometimes passion alone was not enough to build a career in such a challenging field. Perhaps, he said gently, she might consider enjoying music as a personal hobby instead. The words felt heavier than she expected. For a moment, she stood there silently beside the piano. Years of practice, hope, and quiet determination seemed to press against her thoughts all at once. Part of her wanted to walk away. The embarrassment was difficult to ignore. Standing in front of so many people while being doubted by such an important figure was not easy. But another feeling slowly appeared. She remembered the many mornings she had practiced before work. The nights when the only sound in her small apartment was the gentle music of the keyboard. Those moments had never been about proving anything to anyone. They had simply been about love for music. She looked toward the pianist and spoke quietly but clearly. She asked if she could still play the piece she had prepared. Just one song. The pianist paused. Perhaps he expected her to leave the stage after his comments. The audience waited silently for his response. After a short moment, he nodded. He gestured toward the piano as if to say she could begin. She sat down slowly on the bench. Her hands rested gently above the keys. The room was completely silent. No one knew exactly what was about to happen. For a few seconds, she did not move. Her hands rested gently above the piano keys, and the silence in the concert hall felt deeper than before. The audience watched quietly, waiting for the first note. Her heart was still beating fast. The words spoken only moments earlier were still echoing in her mind. Being doubted in front of so many people was painful. Anyone in her position would have felt the same. But as she sat there, another memory slowly appeared in her thoughts. She remembered the small apartment where she practiced every day. She remembered the old keyboard in the corner of the room, the quiet mornings, and the late nights when no one else was awake. Those moments had never been about proving her worth to others. They had simply been about music. That memory helped calm her mind. She took a slow breath and lowered her hands to the keys. The first note was soft. So soft that for a moment it felt like the sound was floating gently through the air rather than filling the room. A few people in the audience leaned forward slightly, trying to catch every detail. Then the second note followed. And the third. The melody began slowly, like the opening of a quiet story. There was no rush in her playing. Each note was placed carefully with patience and feeling. At first, some people in the audience remained uncertain. They had just witnessed a moment of rejection, and many were not sure what kind of performance to expect. But as the music continued, something began to change. The simple melody started growing stronger. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, gliding across the keys with a natural rhythm. It became clear that she was not thinking about the audience anymore. She was simply playing. The piece she had chosen was emotional and expressive. It carried both sadness and hope within its melody. Every phrase seemed to tell a different part of a story. When the music grew softer, the room felt peaceful. When the melody rose with power, the sound filled the hall in a way that surprised many listeners. Several audience members slowly exchanged glances. This was not the performance they had expected. At the side of the stage, the famous pianist remained seated with his arms crossed. At first, his expression looked calm and slightly distant, as if he were only casually observing. But as the music continued, his posture slowly changed. He leaned forward slightly. His eyes moved from the floor to the pianist at the keyboard. The young woman remained completely focused on the music. Her earlier nervousness had disappeared. The stage lights reflected softly on the polished surface of the piano, while her hands moved smoothly across the keys. She did not rush through the notes. Instead, she allowed the melody to breathe. Every pause between phrases felt meaningful, like a quiet moment in a conversation. Some members of the audience began to feel something unexpected. Emotion. The music was not only technically clear, it carried a feeling that was honest and deeply human. One elderly man in the audience slowly closed his eyes while listening. A young student sitting nearby leaned forward in her chair, completely absorbed in the performance. The melody reached a gentle turning point. Her left hand began creating a deeper rhythm while the right hand carried the main theme higher and higher. The two parts worked together beautifully, like two voices speaking at the same time. Her fingers were not moving with flashy speed or dramatic gestures. Instead, they moved with quiet confidence. Each note seemed to have a purpose. At the back of the room, one of the music teachers whispered something to a colleague. The colleague nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the stage. The atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. Only minutes earlier, people had been thinking about whether she belonged there. Now they were simply listening. The famous pianist continued watching carefully. His expression had grown more serious. The earlier doubt in his eyes was slowly being replaced by curiosity. He noticed the small details in her playing. The way she controlled the volume of each note. The way she allowed the melody to rise and fall naturally. The way she used silence between phrases to create emotion. These were not things that happened by accident. They came from understanding music deeply. The piece continued building toward its most powerful section. Her hands moved with greater energy now, pressing the keys with strength while still maintaining control. The melody filled the entire concert hall. For the first time, the famous pianist uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees as he listened more closely. The audience could feel the intensity growing. Every note seemed to carry the weight of her entire journey. The years of practicing alone, the moments of doubt, and the love she had always felt for music. But she was not thinking about any of those things now. She was simply playing the story inside the music. The powerful section slowly softened again, returning to the gentle theme that had opened the piece. Now the melody sounded even more emotional than before. Her fingers moved more slowly, almost carefully, as if she were holding something fragile. The audience remained completely silent. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. The room felt as though time itself had slowed down. The famous pianist watched her hands closely. His expression was no longer distant or skeptical. Instead, he looked thoughtful. The final section of the piece approached quietly. Her hands returned to the middle of the keyboard, playing a soft repeating pattern that slowly faded in volume. Each note seemed to drift gently into the air before disappearing. The melody felt peaceful, almost reflective, as if the music itself was taking one final deep breath. Her fingers pressed the final notes with delicate care. Then the sound slowly faded away. Her hands remained resting on the keys for a moment. The concert hall was completely silent. No one moved. It was the kind of silence that happens only after something meaningful has just taken place. She slowly lifted her hands from the piano. The performance was finished, but the reaction had not yet begun. The last note slowly faded into the quiet air of the concert hall. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained completely still, as if everyone was holding their breath. Her hands rested gently above the piano keys before she slowly lowered them into her lap. She sat there without moving, unsure what would happen next. The silence felt long, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are still thinking about what they have just experienced. Many in the audience had expected a short performance that would simply pass by. Instead, they had just listened to something that felt deeply real. A woman sitting in the third row blinked slowly, as if she had been lost in the music. A young student near the front leaned back in her chair, still staring at the piano. At the side of the stage, the famous pianist remained seated. His expression looked very different from before. Earlier, his posture had been distant and doubtful. Now his eyes were fixed on the piano bench where the young woman sat quietly. For several seconds, he said nothing. The audience waited. Then, somewhere near the back of the hall, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound echoed gently across the room. Another person joined. Then another. Within moments, the applause grew louder and spread through the entire audience. People who had been silent only seconds earlier were now clapping with energy and appreciation. Some audience members even stood from their seats. The young woman looked up in surprise. She had expected a polite reaction at best, maybe a few short claps before the next participant was called. But this was different. The applause continued, filling the hall with warmth and support. Her face showed a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had simply played the music she loved, without thinking about impressing anyone. Yet the reaction around her felt powerful. After a while, the applause slowly began to fade. The famous pianist finally stood up from his chair. The room became quiet again as he walked slowly toward the center of the stage. His footsteps were calm, but everyone in the audience was watching carefully. He stopped beside the piano and looked toward the young woman. For a moment, it seemed as though he was choosing his words carefully. Then he spoke. His voice was calm but clear enough for the entire room to hear. He admitted that he had made a mistake earlier. When he first heard about her background, he had assumed that her playing would not reach the level expected in a professional masterclass. His experience in the music world had taught him that formal training usually played an important role in shaping great musicians. But, he continued, music had a way of surprising people. He turned slightly toward the audience while speaking. What they had just heard, he explained, was not simply someone pressing the correct notes on a piano. It was something deeper. The performance had carried emotion, patience, and honesty. Those qualities, he said, cannot always be taught in a classroom. Many students spend years learning technique and theory. Those things are valuable and important. But sometimes, The heart of music comes from a place that cannot be easily measured. The audience listened carefully. The young woman remained seated at the piano bench, unsure how to react. The famous pianist looked back at her. He spoke again, this time more directly. He said that the performance they had just heard reminded him why people fall in love with music in the first place. Music was not only about speed or perfection. It was about telling a story through sound. It was about making people feel something. And during those few minutes at the piano, she had done exactly that. A quiet murmur of agreement passed through the audience. Some of the students sitting in the front rows nodded slightly. The famous pianist then did something that surprised many people in the room. He applauded. Standing beside the piano, he brought his hands together and began clapping for her performance. The audience immediately followed again, filling the hall with a second round of applause. This time the sound felt even stronger. The young woman stood up slowly from the bench. She looked both grateful and overwhelmed by the attention. For someone who had spent years practicing alone in a small apartment, this moment felt almost unreal. The famous pianist continued speaking once the applause faded again. He explained that moments like this were important reminders for everyone in the music community. Talent and passion can appear in unexpected places. Sometimes the most powerful performances come from people who simply love the music deeply. He encouraged the students in the audience to remember that technique should always serve expression. Without emotion, even the most perfect performance can feel empty. Then he turned back toward the young woman one more time. His voice softened slightly. He said that earlier he had suggested she might keep music as a hobby. After hearing her play, he no longer believed that advice was correct. The audience reacted with quiet laughter and warm smiles. He told her that her musical voice deserved to be heard and developed further. With the right guidance and opportunities, there was no reason she could not continue growing as a pianist. For a moment, the young woman did not know what to say. She simply nodded gently, showing appreciation for his words. The atmosphere in the concert hall felt very different from the beginning of the masterclass. What had started as a moment of doubt had turned into something meaningful for everyone in the room. Students who had arrived expecting a technical lesson had just witnessed a reminder about the true purpose of music. The famous pianist finally stepped aside and gestured toward the audience once more. He invited them to give her one last round of applause before the masterclass continued. The hall filled with clapping again. This time the sound felt warmer, more personal. The young woman gave a small, grateful bow before stepping away from the piano. As she walked toward the side of the stage, many people in the audience were still watching her with admiration. Only minutes earlier, she had been standing there feeling uncertain and embarrassed. Now she was leaving the stage with something far more valuable: respect. The applause slowly faded as she stepped away from the piano. Her heart was still beating fast, but the nervous pressure she had felt earlier was gone. Instead, there was a quiet sense of relief inside her. She walked carefully down the small steps at the side of the stage. The lights above the piano still shined brightly, but now they were behind her. For a moment, she wondered if everything that had just happened was real. Only a short time earlier, she had been standing in front of the same audience while being told that her musical path might not lead anywhere. Those words had been difficult to hear. Yet now the entire room had applauded her performance, and even the famous pianist had spoken with respect about her playing. As she returned to her seat among the other participants, several people nearby smiled warmly. One student leaned slightly toward her and whispered that the performance had been beautiful. Another gave a quiet nod of encouragement. These small reactions meant more to her than they realized. For years she had practiced alone, without teachers or classmates who understood her musical journey. Most of her learning had come from listening carefully, repeating difficult sections, and trusting her own instincts. Now, sitting in a room filled with trained musicians, she felt something she had never experienced before. She felt accepted. The masterclass continued as the next participant was invited onto the stage. Music once again filled the hall as another piece began. But for many people in the audience, the earlier performance was still fresh in their minds. The famous pianist also seemed more thoughtful now. As he listened to the next performer, he offered helpful advice and technical suggestions, just as he had earlier. But his tone carried a slightly different energy, almost as if he had been reminded of something important. From her seat, she watched quietly. Her hands were still resting gently together in her lap, and she occasionally looked down at them. The same fingers that had spent years practicing on an old keyboard had just played in one of the most beautiful concert halls she had ever seen. The thought made her smile softly. After several more performances, the masterclass finally came to an end. The audience gave one last round of applause to thank the pianist for sharing his knowledge and time. People slowly began standing up and gathering their belongings. Some students hurried toward the stage, hoping to ask questions or receive advice. Others spoke excitedly with their teachers about what they had learned during the event. She remained seated for a moment longer, letting the crowd move around her. The emotional energy of the day had been intense, and she wanted to take a few seconds to breathe and process everything. Eventually she stood up and began walking toward the exit. Just before reaching the lobby, she heard a familiar voice behind her. It was the famous pianist. He had stepped away from a small group of students and was now walking toward her. She stopped and turned to face him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then he smiled politely. His earlier serious expression had softened. He began by thanking her for staying on the stage and playing the piece despite the difficult moment earlier. He admitted that not everyone would have had the courage to do that. She listened quietly, still feeling slightly surprised to be having this conversation. He continued speaking in a calm and thoughtful tone. He explained that when he first heard about her background, he had reacted based on his long experience in the professional music world. Most of the musicians he had trained had spent many years in structured programs with strict guidance. Because of that, he had developed certain expectations. But music, he said again, has a way of challenging expectations. What he had heard during her performance reminded him that passion and dedication can create powerful results, even without traditional training. He asked her how long she had been playing the piano. She told him the truth. She described the small community center where she had first touched a piano as a child. She talked about the old keyboard she had received years later and the countless hours she had spent practicing in her apartment. She explained that she worked during the day and practiced whenever she could find time. The pianist listened carefully to every word. When she finished, he nodded slowly. He said that her story was not common, but it was also not impossible. Throughout music history, there had been people who discovered their abilities in unexpected ways. What mattered most, he explained, was the willingness to continue learning. He asked whether she had ever considered studying music more formally. The question surprised her. For years, the idea of attending a professional music academy had felt too distant to imagine. Those places seemed reserved for people who had started their training very young with experienced teachers. She admitted that she had thought about it but never believed it would truly be possible. The pianist paused for a moment. Then he gave her a simple piece of advice. He told her that talent and passion are important beginnings, but growth requires guidance and opportunity. If she truly wanted to continue her journey in music, she should not be afraid to seek those opportunities. He encouraged her to meet teachers, attend workshops, and perform whenever possible. Every experience would help her develop further. The path might not always be easy, but the love for music she had shown on stage was something worth protecting. His words felt sincere. They were not promises of fame or success. Instead, they were practical encouragement from someone who understood the long road of becoming a musician. Before leaving, he shook her hand warmly. He wished her luck and said he hoped to hear her play again someday. As he walked away to speak with other students, she stood quietly in the lobby. The building was slowly becoming less crowded as people began leaving. Outside the large glass doors, the afternoon sunlight filled the street. She stepped outside and took a deep breath of fresh air. The city looked the same as it had that morning. Cars moved through the streets, people walked along the sidewalks, and everyday life continued. But inside her, something had changed. One song had turned a moment of doubt into a moment of possibility, and the journey that once felt uncertain now felt open again. The evening air felt calm as she walked away from the music academy. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, painting the buildings with warm golden light. People were moving along the sidewalks, talking, laughing, and continuing their daily routines. To anyone passing by, she probably looked like an ordinary person leaving an event. But inside her mind, the entire day continued to replay again and again. Only that morning she had walked into the academy feeling nervous and uncertain. She had questioned whether she even belonged in a room filled with trained musicians. Then came the moment on stage when the famous pianist had doubted her path. Those words had felt heavy at the time, like a door slowly closing. Yet something unexpected had happened after that. She had played anyway. That simple decision had changed everything. As she reached the bus stop, she sat down on the bench and watched the traffic pass. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, the same hands that had just performed in front of a large audience. For years she had practiced in silence, often wondering if anyone would ever hear her music. Now people had not only heard it, but they had responded with warmth and respect. The thought made her smile. When she arrived back at her apartment later that evening, the familiar space greeted her with its quiet comfort. The room looked exactly the same as it always had. The small table near the window, the worn sofa against the wall, and in the corner, the old keyboard that had been part of her life for so long. She walked over to it slowly. For a moment she simply looked at the keys, remembering the countless hours she had spent practicing there. Some days had been full of excitement when a new piece finally began to sound right. Other days had been frustrating when her fingers refused to cooperate. But through every moment, the music had remained important to her. She sat down and pressed a single note. The soft sound filled the quiet room. It felt different now, not because the keyboard had changed, but because she had changed. The events of the day had given her something she had never fully felt before. Confidence. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but a quiet belief that her voice through music truly mattered. She began playing the same piece she had performed at the masterclass earlier that day. The melody flowed gently through the room. Without the stage lights and the large audience, the music felt even more personal. As she played, she remembered the moment when the audience had first started clapping. She remembered the famous pianist standing beside the piano and admitting he had been wrong to judge so quickly. Those memories still felt almost unreal, but they had happened. After finishing the piece, she leaned back slightly on the bench and allowed the final note to fade away. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone in her musical journey. In the days that followed, the memory of the masterclass continued to spread quietly among the people who had attended. Students talked about it with their teachers. Audience members shared the story with friends and family. Some even posted short recordings or descriptions online. Many people were inspired by the moment they had witnessed. It was not simply about a performance. It was about someone refusing to walk away from the piano when doubt appeared. Within a short time, small messages of encouragement began reaching her. A music teacher who had attended the event contacted her with an offer to help guide her practice. Another musician invited her to join a small community concert where local performers shared their music. These opportunities were not grand or glamorous, but to her they meant everything. Each invitation was another small step forward. She accepted them with gratitude and continued practicing every day, just as she always had. The difference now was that her path no longer felt invisible. People were beginning to notice. Months passed, and her playing continued to grow stronger. With guidance from experienced musicians and more chances to perform, she slowly discovered new layers of confidence and expression in her music. The old keyboard in her apartment remained her faithful companion, but now she also spent time practicing on better instruments in rehearsal spaces and small concert venues. Every time she sat down at a piano, she remembered the lesson she had learned during the masterclass. Music is not only about where someone starts. It is about the passion they carry and the courage to continue even when others doubt them. One afternoon, while preparing for another small performance, she received an unexpected message. It was from the famous pianist. He had heard that she was continuing to perform and develop her skills. In the message, he wrote that he was glad she had not allowed that difficult moment during the masterclass to discourage her. He wished her success and encouraged her to keep sharing her music with the world. Reading those words brought a quiet sense of closure. The moment that had once felt painful had become part of a larger story. A story about resilience. A story about believing in something deeply enough to stand up for it. Years later, people would still talk about the masterclass where a young woman had walked onto the stage with no formal training and played a song that changed the atmosphere of the entire room. But for her, the most important part of that day was not the applause. It was the decision she made in that silent moment before the first note. Instead of walking away, she chose to play. And sometimes, all it takes is one song to change everything.